Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Return to Castle Wolfenstein for PC, Mac, Linux, Xbox, and PlayStation 2. This is a first-person shooter that was actually worked on by 4 different studios. Specifically, Grey Matter Interactive did the single-player, Nerve Software did the multiplayer, id Software oversaw the whole project, and then later on Splash Damage added in a few maps for Game of the Year edition. So it was kind of a Frankenstein's monster, if you will, on that particular regard. And it is the follow-up to the original Wolfenstein 3D. It is not a sequel to it in terms of plotline or anything, but it does feature the same character, B.J. Blazkowicz. It does feature a lot of the same ideas and such, but it does play very, very differently from that, as to be expected from releasing about 9 years later. The original Wolfenstein 3D was released on May 5th of 1992, and we actually just celebrated the 20th anniversary of that, making me feel a little old in the process. But this was released about 9 years later, November 19th, 2001. And then the following year for Mac and Linux, and the following year after that for Xbox and PlayStation 2. And this thing had absolutely massive expectations leveled at it when it was being developed and announced and everything. So the question really became, did it measure up to everyone's expectations, which were just so ridiculously high? I mean, seriously, Wolfenstein 3D shaped the FPS genre as we know it today. Without it, you probably wouldn't have Doom. And without Doom, an FPS probably wouldn't be popular at all today. So, you have to wonder, did this thing just suffer from ridiculous over-expectations, or did it fully succeed in them? Well, at the time, the visuals were on Quake 3 engine, and of course it was pretty heavily modified, and it looked phenomenal at the time. The faces in particular were particularly well detailed. Characters in general, I should say, were particularly well detailed. First-person modeling and animation weren't all that great, though. As you can see in this video, the animations for the weapons are particularly robotic and ultimately don't look all that great. And some of the textures and modeling just seem really flat. In fact, there's not a lot of stuff going on in those particular regards, which is pretty normal for that time, so it's understandable. And luckily enough, this has aged pretty well for a 3D game, because there's nothing really today that you can look at and say this is distracting because it looks like crap. They did pack an absolutely massive amount of detail into it for what they could do with it in terms of the technical aspect. So, in that particular regard, they have done an absolutely phenomenal job. As far as sound design goes, the sound effects themselves, top-notch. All of the gun sounds are beefy and concussive. All of the explosions sound nice, well, for the most part. There are a few here and there that don't sound particularly amazing, but it's mostly great sound. Voice acting is kind of cheesy, and it's meant to be, so it fits the game absolutely perfectly. I mean, Wolfenstein 3D was just kind of absurd and over the top, and Return to Castle Wolfenstein, while it's toned down a little bit, it's still pretty absurd and over the top. So they kind of played that up a little bit with the voice acting, and it did a pretty good job. There's a few things here and there that sound much like the kind of early era of voice acting, where people were just kind of reading their scripts and not really acting all that much. But other than that, voice acting does a good job. One thing I didn't particularly like about it was the music. It's not bad music by any stretch of the imagination, it's just stock. It's your standard kind of action-y music, and it works okay, but it's nothing particularly amazing or memorable. But what really matters are the story and the gameplay, although the story takes a little bit of a backseat because it's pretty ridiculous. You play as the American agent B.J. Blazkowicz as he goes on his operation to find out what the SS Paranormal Division is doing and stop it. And it starts off with you being captured and held in Castle Wolfenstein, and you have to escape. So it's a great homage to the original game, Wolfenstein 3D, where the first episode was Escape from the Castle. And there's a lot of homages throughout the game that are fairly subtle in a lot of cases, and some of them not so much. But it's got some nice little homages here and there that make you really feel like the game is Wolfenstein, rather than just this first-person shooter with the Wolfenstein name slapped on it. And it is, in fact, a Wolfenstein game. It feels like one, as opposed to just a game with the name slapped on it, which is nice, considering that the game plays pretty much completely differently. Anyway, the story itself involves the undead, the supernatural, that sort of thing, super soldier programs, And it's a pretty ridiculous storyline that you ultimately don't care about. So it falls to the gameplay. Now, that escape sequence that I mentioned establishes one of the brand new mechanics to this game, that's stealth. Now, while this isn't a stealth-focused game like, say, Thief, the stealth mechanics themselves work pretty well. You can sneak up behind enemies and backstab them for an instant and silent kill. You can also use suppressed weapons to take out enemies very quietly and without raising an alarm. And you can actually take out alarms to prevent the enemy from triggering them, and suddenly everybody's converging on your position and wiping you out. You have to play this a little bit more intelligently than you do Wolfenstein 3D, for instance, which is more action-oriented. You can just run in guns blazing if you want. You can do that in this as well, for the most part. There is one level that actually requires stealth. Otherwise, if you trigger an alarm, instant game over. You have to start the level over. It's annoying. But stealth is an option in this game, and it's generally a good idea to do it. If you can. If you can't, or if you don't want to, that's fine too. It accommodates both. The weapon variety is pretty simple for the most part. It's mostly World War II weapons that we're all used to, stuff like the MP40 or the Luger and stuff like that. But you also get access to a couple of more interesting weapons, like the Snooper rifle, which is kind of cool. It's got a night vision scope on it and suppressed. It's everything that's awesome about stealth and sniping. And you also get the Venom gun and the Tesla gun. Tesla gun, which is immensely satisfying because, you know, science. And the Venom gun, which is just this ridiculously fast chain gun. Very satisfying to use because it liquefies enemies very quickly. But the weapons themselves are pretty well balanced out. By the time you get the really powerful weapons, you're fighting really powerful enemies that have a ludicrous amount of health, and as such take quite a few shots to bring down. So the difficulty does scale as you go through the game. The further you get, the harder it gets. This is a good thing. Although I must say that the final boss fight is pretty ridiculously easy, apart from the lead up to it, I guess is the way you'd say it. Like the level before, basically. But for the most part, the single player is a pretty typical first-person shooter experience, only just really well done, really well polished. There's nothing in here that's particularly out of place. Everything fits together very well. You never really feel like you're doing too much of the same, I guess is what you should say. They don't really have the whole find the key cards thing that got kind of annoying in older first-person shooters. They do have this thing where you need to find objectives that and complete them in order to actually finish the level. You do have completion ratings and all that. You do have health packs and such. But it all feels very much like a more modern take on that, and it's done very well. So the single player is top-notch. It's not groundbreaking or anything in that regard, but it's a very well done single player that's fun to play. Multiplayer surprised everybody, however, because we didn't really expect this sort of depth in multiplayer. It is class-based and team-based. So you have 4 classes that you can play as throughout the game. Soldier, Medic, Lieutenant, and Engineer. Each of which has its own abilities, like, for instance, the Lieutenant can give you ammo resupplies, or the Medic can heal you or resurrect you, basically, with a adrenaline syringe. Stuff like that. So it adds quite a bit of depth to the gameplay. It makes you work as a team in order to actually complete your objectives, because that's what this game is, objective-based multiplayer. You do have a couple other modes that are available to you, but it's still pretty much all objective-based and requires you to work as a team, as different classes in order to win. And it's pretty fun to play. I must say, though, Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, which was the dedicated multiplayer expansion, so to speak, it was free and to everybody, that did do it better. The maps were better. Just the gameplay was a little more balanced out, so that helped quite a bit. And ultimately, Enemy Territory just has more fun multiplayer than base Return to Castle Wolfenstein. But it's pretty much the same thing. They just added in more stuff in Enemy Territory, and it's more balanced. It works out very well. And to be honest with you, I don't really play much of Return to Castle Wolfenstein's multiplayer. I didn't even do that back in the day. I mostly played Enemy Territory when it came out because it was just so much better. So primarily for me, Return to Castle Wolfenstein is a single-player game. So you have this kind of complete package. You have Return to Castle Wolfenstein, which is a great single-player experience with pretty solid multiplayer, which was improved in enemy territory. Is it what we hoped for? Yeah, actually. It's exactly what we asked for. We just wanted a really good first-person shooter experience, and that's exactly what we got. That's why I give this a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.